Well, today we're going to go into part 2 of the series, The Overcomers. Last week I talked about the profile of an overcomer, and I told you this, the prerequisite to being an overcomer was adversity, trials, tribulation, trouble in life. Well, if you didn't like last week's message, you're going to hate this morning's message, because I'm going to talk about the prerequisite of success. And the prerequisite of success is failure. You already figured it out. And so this is what you're going to find out today, is that the pathway to success is paved with failure. I'm going to try to convince you today that the failures in your life are actually not something you should despise, but rather gifts from God that you should embrace. This is going to be a bit of a challenge, isn't it? Because I have discovered in life this, that failure is not the opposite of success. Failure is the prerequisite of success. I'll give you an example. If I wrote a book about failure and I didn't sell any copies, that would make me a success, wouldn't it? You can think about that one. So there's this CEO, he takes on this new company and he decides he's going to shake it up. It's become a little stale. And so he goes down first day and he goes into the office pool and they're all standing around working. And he looks around and it's 10 to noon, 10 minutes to 12. And he sees one guy standing by the wall, by the elevators, just standing there doing nothing. And he goes up to him and he's going to make an example of him. And he says, "Excuse me, how much do you make a week?" He says, $400. And he pulls out $800 from his pocket, counts out the $800, says, "That's 2 weeks' wages. You get out of here, and I never want to see you again." He gets in the elevator, he goes down, he turns to all these people in absolute utter shock, and he says to them, "Does anybody even know what that slacker did around here?" Someone said, "Yes, sir. He's the pizza delivery guy for Domino's." Well, we're going to look at a story of failure in the Scripture, and it's one of the famous stories of Jesus. And we're going to have a look at this, and we're going to look how failure turned into a great success. And it's in Mark chapter 2, and we're going to just read the first part of the story, and I'll remind you how it ends, but I think you'll know anyway. Verse 1 says this, "And again he entered Capernaum after some days, and it was heard that he was in the house. Immediately, many gathered together so that there was no longer room to receive them, not even near the door. And he preached the word to them. Then they came to him, bringing a paralytic who was carried by 4 men. And when they could not come near him because of the crowd, they uncovered the roof where he was. And when they had broken through, they let down the bed on which the paralytic was lying. And Jesus saw their faith. He said to the paralytic, 'Son, your sins are forgiven.'" So let's set up this story. We know a few things about it. We know that it happened in the city of Capernaum. And we know it happened in the house. Now, Jesus wasn't from Capernaum. He was from Nazareth. But we do know who was from Capernaum. Who was it? It was one of his disciples. It was Peter. Peter was from there. And his house is sort of a famous landmark today. And if you go, how many of you have been to Capernaum? Anybody been to Israel and been to Capernaum to visit? And one of the things you do when you go to Capernaum, remarkably well-preserved ancient city, is you can find what they claim is Peter's house. I doubt it, but it's always, nice to make stuff up. And so this is what Peter's house looked like, and it's an octagonal-shaped house. It's a very unusual ancient house, and they claim, there's even a sign on it that says Peter's house. This is what it used to look like. Unfortunately, they have built this museum on top of Peter's house. This is what it looks like today. Seriously, it's ridiculous. It looks like a spaceship on top of this. At least you get the same bird's eye view that those guys saw as they were letting this man down on the ropes. But anyway, so here's the story. We know where it was. We know that it was probably in Peter's house. Jesus goes in. He's preaching the word to these people. The crowd comes. The house is filled. Even people are packed all around. And then along comes these 4 guys with their friend. And their friend's a paralytic, and he's on a bed. And they're carrying this bed. And they bring him over to the house, and they can't get in. And so then they do something I find quite remarkable. They took him up on the roof, and they started tearing the roof up. And then they lower him down on ropes, down through the roof. Down he comes, and Jesus sees him and saw his faith, and Jesus is absolutely impressed by their level of faith. I don't think Peter was quite as excited about it. What do you think? I mean, if I'm thinking I'm having a home group in my house and somebody decides they're going to visit and come through the roof and they start tearing up my shingles, and like that's the last thing. Whoa, I'm not excited. I'm not impressed, but Jesus was. He was impressed by the faith of these guys. He begins by saying, son, your sins are forgiven. And if you go read the rest of the story, you discover that this man actually gets healed, and he walks out of that house carrying his bed. He came in on a bed, paralytic. He's completely healed. Pick up your bed and walk. He walks out the door. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at this story today, and we're going to discover what it was that got them from what could have been a massive failure to an immense success. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to give you the failure formula. A bunch of you are thinking, you know, Pastor Mark, I already know how to do that. I don't really need your help. Well, actually you do, because you need to learn how to turn failure into success, and that's what I'm going to teach you today. And there's three things I see in this story, and this is what they are. Number one, they're inspired by inadequacy. Number two, they are driven by deficiency. And number three, they are fueled by failure. So we look at this story. What was it that happened? What was so unique? The first thing was they were inspired by inadequacy. Well, what was the inadequacy? Well, they come to this house. There's no way they can get in. The guy, for goodness sakes, is on a gurney or a bed. There's no way he's going to be able to muscle his way through that crowd. So he's in a very powerful state of inadequacy. And what could they do about it? I mean, I suppose they could write a letter to City Council of Capernaum and claim it was not wheelchair friendly. Or maybe they could, shout fire into a crowded room and hope people leave. Or they could turn and walk away defeated. But that's not what they did. What they did was they employed a radical solution. They were inspired by this inadequacy, and they did something so unique that Jesus was royally impressed, and it says he saw their faith. I want to remind you what the definition of faith is. It's in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. And it says, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things unseen. You see, faith is not about what you have. It's not about your adequacy. It's about what you don't have. It's about what you are hoping for. It's what is unseen. And so a lot of times we think, well, if we don't have the wherewithal, we can't succeed. That's where you're wrong. It actually is faith is entirely based on what you don't have, what you hope for. It's based on your inadequacy. And the situation with these guys was what they didn't have. And we see this miracle came as a result of them responding to their lack. As you go through Scripture, you actually see almost every single miracle was a result of someone's inadequacy and being inspired in the midst of inadequacy. You will remember the feeding of the 5,000. What was the inadequacy? They didn't have enough food. They were short of food, and the miracle came because they didn't have enough. Now think about this. If in that situation they had 1,000 loaves of bread and 500 fish, then that wasn't a miracle. They didn't need faith. We didn't need to see God move. And there was no failure that produced a success. But the situation was they were grossly inadequate and insufficient. We have the story of David going up against Goliath, one of our famous stories. And we have this little shrimpy shepherd boy going up against a 9'9" giant who was a warrior from his youth. What was the inadequacy? Well, let's see. He had no shield. He had no spear. He had no javelin. He had no height. He had no strength. He didn't have much going into this. And it was based out of that inadequacy that we see the miracle coming. See, but here's where we struggle. Most of us, when we look at our inadequacy in life, we resent the fact that we don't have enough instead of being inspired by it. Instead of looking at it and saying, this is an opportunity to overcome something, this is an opportunity to exercise faith, faith being the substance of things hoped for. Let me give you an example from the world in which we live. You can finish this for me. Necessity is the mother of invention. Necessity is the mother of invention. See, invention and progress in the world hasn't come out of what we have, but what we don't have. It's inspired by a need. It's inspired by inadequacy. It's inspired by necessity. And everything that has happened, all progress in our world, actually comes out of problems. It actually comes out of the fact that you don't have something, so you create something to solve the problem. And all progression in human history, or at least most of it as you look at it, was always a response to some inadequacy or some deficiency. I'll give you an example I think you'll all get. Anybody in the room old enough that they grew up with a wood stove? Anybody grew up with a wood stove? Why are all these young people putting up their hand? I don't get this. Seriously, you grew up with a wood stove? You poor sucker. He's younger than I am. But I remember the wood stove because my grandmother had one in her cottage, and the cottage didn't have power, and we had a wood stove, and breakfast was a nuisance. It took 3 hours. You had to chop wood, and you had to build a fire, you had to get the stupid stove hot enough, then you could finally make breakfast. It was a big ordeal. And I remember when the power finally came to my grandmother's cottage, the first thing my dad did was he took that wood stove and he threw it into the bush. He was so sick of the wood stove. And what happened was progress came because that was problematic. It was inadequate. And we had power, so now we got the electric range. But we didn't stop with the electric range because there was something that came out that was even better. You know what it was? The toaster oven. Remember the toaster oven? It's small, it's compact, you plug it into the wall, and it was super fast compared to the stove, as long as your meal was no bigger than the size of a piece of toast, right? And then about 35, 40 years ago, we came up with the ultimate in cooking utensils, right? The microwave. Why? We were in a hurry. We needed it to, we're going from the wood stove, now we got the microwave. Never mind that we're bombarding the food with radioactive rays. Done. And we don't care what it actually does to the food. Now, I'm wondering if it has escaped your notice that even though we're still using the microwave, it is probably the worst food cooking device ever invented. Yes, it's fast, but it's not good. I mean, these settings you have in your microwave, I was looking at mine this morning. There was beverage, popcorn, potato. They need to rename those settings. And this is what the settings, in truth in advertising, the settings should read something like this. Setting 1, 1 minute, food still frozen. Setting 2, outside of food, lava hot, inside, still frozen. Setting 3, bowl, untouchably hot, food still cold. Setting 4, both bowl and food liquefied and splattered all over the inside of the microwave. The microwave is a ridiculous appliance, yet we still use it. Why do we use it? Because it's fast. And look at progress. Anybody know what the latest thing is in high-end kitchens? The wood-fired pizza oven. We had some friends put one in. It cost them $10,000. I looked at that. I said, my grandmother had one of those. It's still in the bush. I'll sell it to you for $2,000. So that's what happens. Progress comes as a result of inadequacy. See, all progress, all life, all success is really inspired by inadequacy. I want to tell you a story about a man out of history. He was born in the 1840s, and he actually had a bit of a rough start in life, to say the least. His father was unemployed, for one thing. He went to school, did very badly at school, and if that wasn't bad enough, he got scarlet fever. Ended up having to be out of school for 2 years due to his scarlet fever. Went back after 2 years and couldn't. He was so far behind, it just wasn't going to happen. His mother pulled him out of school and was homeschooling. Then, because of the scarlet fever, he began to lose his hearing. He became some behavior problems started to develop. He's stubborn, he was awkward, he was a social misfit, and so just nothing but trouble. This guy was getting a really bad start in life. Not only that, but whatever his parents bought, he was always curious about everything, and he started taking everything apart. He loved to play with fire, in particular, was one of his favorite things, and he burned down the family barn. And so finally, at 15 years of age, if you can imagine, this kid finally left home. His parents were probably thrilled. He had an IQ of 81. Average is 100. He was at 81. So he's losing his hearing. He goes out into the world, and he gets a job as a trained telegraph operator. Now, the reason he liked the telegraph was because even though he was losing his hearing, he could hear the clicks of the telegraph. And in fact, he loved Morse code, so much so that he named his kids, no joke, Dot and Dash, right? And so here's this guy, he loves the telegraph because that works, the clicks and the noises, it works for him. He moves to New York City, gets involved with this company that's working with the stock ticker coming from the New York Stock Exchange. Now, it's basically the same concept as the telegraph, and he managed to actually improve on the telegraph. He invented a way for it to send out 4 messages at once, and then he improved improved the stock ticker as well. And the company he was involved with, Western Union, you've all heard of it, they paid him a princely sum of $40,000 for his inventions. He took that money, went off and decided he was going to be self-employed and go into business for himself. He bought a warehouse, a factory, and he began to discover new ways to deal with problems and began to manufacture these things. He invented a few things probably you've heard of. He invented this thing that recorded music and voices. It was called the phonograph. Any of you ever heard of that? He invented this thing called the movie picture camera, a motion picture camera. He invented this thing called the light bulb. Anybody know who I'm talking about? Yeah, the light bulb just went off for you. I'm talking about Thomas Edison. And I mean, here's an amazing man who held patents of 2,332 patents that he discovered. And what he did was he looked at life, he looked at the problems. See, when you see problems in life, many of us, we see problems. When he saw problems, he looked for solutions. And he would go and he was literally inspired by inadequacy. Anytime he saw something that didn't work, he invented something to make it work. And many of you will remember that Thomas Edison said this. He said that genius, because here's a guy with an IQ of 41, not exactly in the, or 81 rather, not exactly in the genius category. He said this, genius is 1% inspiration and what? 99% perspiration. Boy, my clothes sure smell bad. I added that. He didn't actually say that. And so the first thing I want you to see here is that really all progress and the success even in your own life should be inspired by inadequacy. But what happens is we allow ourselves to get discouraged by our inadequacy. We resent it, we despise it, rather than embracing it and seeing it as an opportunity to move forward. There was this story of these three clergymen. They got together every week for coffee. One was a Catholic priest, the second one was a Baptist pastor, and the third one was a Jewish rabbi. And they were sitting around one day talking about how hard ministry was and talking about their own inadequacies and dealing with ministry in the modern age. And out of the blue, someone came up with this thought. They said, well, you think ministering to people is hard. You should try ministering to bears. And they went, what? What do you mean bears? He says, yeah, you know, if you can minister to a bear, you could minister to people. And so they came up with this weird idea that they would try a little contest. They would face their inadequacies and they would go out and they would try to make a bear a convert to their religion. So they picked a day, all three of them went out. At the end of the day, all three of them ended up in the hospital. And so there they were, the Catholic priest, he was all scraped up and stitched up, and he was standing there in the hospital, and they said, well, what happened to you? He says, do you have any idea how hard it is to get close enough to a bear to sprinkle holy water on him? But anyway, I succeeded, and he's now an altar boy. And then the Baptist pastor said, there he was not only scraped, he was bruised, and he was in a sling, and he was beat up like nothing else. And they said, what happened to you? He says, do you have any idea how hard it is to baptize a bear? He says, I had to get up, face to face with this bear, and we wrestled. Unfortunately, we were on the side of a hill. We rolled down the hill together and into the river, and I baptized him. He's now a deacon in the church. And then the Jewish rabbi, he was lying in the hospital bed. And he was in traction, and he had broken basically every bone in his body. And he was in traction, and he was wrapped up in a body cast, and only his face was out. And they said, well, what happened to you? He says, do you have any idea how hard it is to circumcise one of those beasts? That was probably a mental image you didn't really need this morning. But nevertheless, you got it. So the first thing is this, is in the failure formula, is to be inspired by inadequacy. The second thing is to be driven by deficiency. You see, it's not good enough just to be inspired by something. You have to now do something about it. You have to act on it. And one of the things I've told you many times is that faith always requires action. And I've sometimes put it in this little rhyme, and it goes like this. Do what you can, use what's on hand, and pray to the man. And I've told you this many times that you have to do something. Faith requires some action, and you have to use what you have. You have to use what's on hand. And so we have this story of the miracle that I mentioned of the feeding of the 5,000. They didn't have no food, they had a little bit of food. They had 5 loaves and 2 fish. And when Jesus said, what do you have? And they said what they had, he could have said, well, that's not going to help us, get rid of it. But instead, he said, bring it to me. And it says he took the bread and he blessed the bread and he broke the bread and he multiplied it and he fed 5,000 plus men and women, or women and children, with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. There was this miracle of multiplication. But don't miss the fact that they were driven by deficiency. They took what little bit they had and they used it. We have this story of David going up against Goliath. We know that he was terribly inadequate. We know what he didn't have, but he didn't have a spear, and he didn't have a sword, and he didn't have a javelin, he didn't have a shield. But what did he have? He had a sling, and he had a slingshot. And so he took his sling and he took 5 smooth stones, and what he did have, he took into battle. And so he wins the battle based on what little bit he had, and using it, something became of it. And we look at the story of these men bringing the man on the gurney when they couldn't get into the building. What didn't they have? Well, they didn't have money, and they didn't have strength, and they couldn't push people away, and they couldn't buy people, pay people to leave, and they couldn't pay for a bigger venue so that maybe they could get in. But what did they have? It's embedded in the story. What they did have was ropes. Why they brought ropes to the party, I don't know, but they did. And so they dug a hole in the roof, and they let the man down on ropes into the place. What little bit they had, they used. And when we look at our life, when we're in tough, and when we're in a situation where we're feeling totally inadequate and totally deficient, what do we have? We need to use what little bit we have, and you'd be amazed at how that turns failure into success. I'm going to tell you another story from history. This man was born in the 1920s, and he was really a poor student, actually. And he was one of those kids at school that was a bit of a social misfit, kind of a loser, if I can put those terms. And they teased him, and they bullied him, and they gave him a nickname. They called him Sparky. And Sparky was a nickname that he hated, and he couldn't shake it, and he was stuck with it for his entire life. And he was really poor at school. When he got into grade 8, he failed every single class in grade 8. Failed every single subject. Imagine that. Usually you fail a few, right? Not every single one, but that's what he did. And the reason is because all he did was he sit around all day doodling. And what he really wanted to do was he wanted to be a cartoonist. And so when he got into high school, finally, after failing his way up there, he gets into high school. Eventually you get through that. You know that. Some of you have been there. And he gets into high school, and he submits his cartoons for the yearbook, and the yearbook doesn't even want him. You know why they didn't want him? They were no good. He'd been spending all these years drawing, and he was still no good at it. So then he decides, well, if the yearbook doesn't want them, maybe what I really want to do with my life is I want to be a cartoonist for Walt Disney. So he sends his cartoons off to Walt Disney, and guess what happens? He gets rejected. Didn't I tell you he was no good? He was no good. That didn't deter him. He kept on drawing, and he kept on sketching. And what he did was he began to write stories, cartoon stories, about his life as a loser. And he began to reproduce his life autobiographically through this cartoon character. A very rudimentary sketch of a little goofy loser kid with a bald head named Charlie Brown. We're talking about Charles Schulz here. And Charlie Brown is Charles Schulz. And this is a completely autobiographical. I want you to just look at that picture a moment. Look at that drawing of Charlie Brown. That is not a very good cartoon. His friends were right. He's not very good at it, but yet he became one of the most famous cartoonists of our age. Why? Because he did not give up, and what little bit he had, he used, and his success came out of a whole series of failures. Now, I want to tell you a personal story about this, and some of you have heard the beginning of this story. Many of you know, and I've told you this before, that I really struggled learning how to read. And when I went into grade 1 and grade 2, I just had a terrible time. I just basically couldn't read. I realize now that I had a bit of a problem, and my problem was I was partially dyslexic. I didn't read entirely backwards, but I got syllables mixed up. And so a lot of times, you'd see something one way and I'd see it another. For example, if you look at the weather, it'd be outlook for tomorrow. When I look at the weather, it's frightening. It's look out for tomorrow. And that's how it reads to me. Christmas was even more terrifying. I got a lot of gifts from Satan. And, I just struggled with reading. Actually, to be honest with you, I still struggle today with reading because I still sort of see things wrong when I read them. It's sort of a miracle that I've written a book because I've barely even read one. So, go figure, right? But anyway, so I go into grade 1, I can't read, I can't write. By the end of grade 1, I can't read, I can't write. But first day of grade 1, I meet David, the other dumbest kid in the class. And it's funny how that works, you know? Birds of a feather flock together. I go to grade 1, I look around, there's David, he's the only guy as dumb as me, and we're attracted to each other. And we became best friends in grade 1, and we were the original Dumb and Dumber. We were the inspiration for that movie. And the way I tell it is I was dumb and he was dumber. Now, he argues with me on that, but I'm pretty sure that's true. And so we were the 2 dumbest kids in the class. No joke. And we just sat there and we didn't learn how to read, either of us. And we both sat by the window so we could look outside the whole day, waiting for recess. Oh, by the way, I was dominating at recess. Nobody could beat me at dodgeball. I was killing that class. And so I would sit there and we'd be sort of slack-jawed and looking out. And, you know, I'd tap him on the shoulder. You know, he sat in front of me. I said, David, what are you doing at recess? Dodgeball. Yeah, me too, dodgeball. Yeah, we're gonna kill a dodgeball. You know, 15 minutes before recess, I start limbering up, you know. Everybody's finishing their exam, and I'm limbering up for dodgeball, because I always imagine we both talked like this. It's my story, I can tell it however I like. And so anyway, we're bumbling, like literally bumbling our way through grade 1, and at the end of grade 1, neither of us can read. And so then they have to make a decision, and this is what I think they did. They flunked him, and they passed me. Now, I don't think I was any smarter than he was. I think what they did was they thought, we can't leave these 2 dummies together. We've got to separate these 2, and I think they probably flipped a coin, and I won. They sent me off to grade 2 to become somebody else's problem, and they left him in grade 1. And so then, you know, consequently what happens is when kids end up in different classes or different grades, your friendship sort of cools. And so anyway, he only lived on the next street, so I saw him all the time, but we weren't tight anymore because we were now in different grades. But I saw him, you know, all the time throughout the years, and, you know, I'd see him and I'd say, hey, Dave, and he'd say, hi, Mark, and we had this acquaintance all the way through grade 12. Then after grade 12, I never saw him again until our 25th high school reunion. Imagine this is 37 years after I met him. And there's one question you always ask, the one question you ask at high school reunions. You know what it is? So what do you do for a living? You know, you always want to see if people lived up to their expectations, right? I mean, it's easy for me. My yearbook quip was most likely to ask, would you like fries with that order? And so this was not going to be hard to live up to this. And so we get to the high school reunion, and I see David, and I go over there, and I said, David, how are you? And of course, then the question, I said, so what are you doing for a living? And this is what he says. He says, I'm a doctor. And I went, what? You're a doctor? I shouldn't have been quite so surprised, but I was. I said, you're a doctor? Do you remember how dumb you were in school? He says, no, but I remember how dumb you were. We were dumb and dumber. So we argued for a little bit who was dumb and who was dumber. I said, you failed, I passed, you were dumber. And so we went on like that. And so finally I said, David, really, you're a doctor? And I said, how did you become a doctor? And he says, don't you remember in grade 1, I always said I wanted to be a doctor? I said, oh, I thought you wanted to play doctor with Lori Vogt, who used to sit in front of me. I didn't know you wanted to actually be a doctor. He says, yeah, I always wanted to be a doctor. You don't remember? And I said, oh, wow, that's incredible. And I said, so what happened? He says, well, all through school, we would take those aptitude tests. And they would tell me that whatever I did, I should probably do something with my hands. So I decided to be a surgeon, is what I decided to do. And he said, when I got into science, I had to work harder than anybody else to get into medical school. And when I got into medical school, I had to work harder than anybody else because it was hard for me. And I got through medical school, and I passed medical school, and I became the surgeon that I am today. I became the doctor I am today because I worked harder than anybody else. And I mean, it was a remarkable moment. I was so proud of him. Because think about this, the school we went to was Oakenwald School. It's literally 3 blocks down this street. If you go down this street, you'll see Oakenwald School. And the 2 dumbest kids to ever come out of Oakenwald School were standing there together, one of them with a nationally televised TV program, and the other one's a doctor. I mean, that's a crazy story. Don't ever worry when your kids get a slow start, for goodness sakes. All they really need is a dream in their heart. We all get a slow start. We all have struggles in life. We will all have failures in life. That is not a sign of what's going to happen to you in the end. You take the dreams and you apply yourself to those dreams and you make your way down this path to success that is paved with failures. You see, failure isn't the opposite of success. It is the prerequisite of success. You know, I have this friend, he's a pastor, and he, all his life he wanted to go to Africa and do an evangelistic crusade. And last year he got invited to go to Africa, to Uganda, and to the university at Gaba, Uganda, and to do a crusade there, and he was so excited about it. And he was telling his kids, he has 3 daughters, and they're about, 7, 9, and 11, something like that. So he's telling his 3 daughters, and he said, girls, if you have a dream in your heart, if you will hold on to that dream, someday God will help you fulfill that dream. And he was telling them. And then he turned to his daughters and he said, what's the dream in your heart? And his eldest is a soccer player. And she says, well, my dream is that when I'm older, I would travel the world playing soccer and preaching the gospel to people as I travel around the world. It was a pretty good dream. Then he turned to the second one and he says, what's your dream? She's only 9 years old. She says, well, my dream is that when I'm older, I'd go to Africa and I'd go to one of those orphanages you're talking about and I would take care of the orphans in the orphanage. And then he turned to his youngest, about 6 or 7 years old, and he says, honey, what's your dream? She says, well, my dream is that when I'm older, I just want to lie on the couch, watch TV, and eat pizza. Dare to dream. That's what I say. So the first thing is to be inspired by inadequacy. The second thing, to be driven by deficiency. And the last and final thing is to be fueled by failure. You know, when these 4 men and their friend went to this home, they could have just looked at the crowd and looked at the fact that they couldn't get into this house, and they could have walked away defeated, and that could have been their failure. They could have ended with that failure. But they were fueled by their failure, and they decided that they were not going to allow this to be the last chapter in this story. And they employed some radical solution by opening that roof and going down through that roof. And Jesus credited their faith for this thing. And as you look at life, as I've said again and again, everybody goes through failures. One of the things that made Thomas Edison such a success was he didn't understand the concept of failure. He saw failure as always just stepping stones and building blocks. And you will remember I said he invented the light bulb. That's actually not true. The light bulb was invented by Henry Woodward, Canadian. But he couldn't get the thing to work for more than a few seconds. And so he sold the patent to Thomas Edison, who tried 10,000 different ways to get it to work before he stumbled on the tungsten filament that actually made the incandescent bulb that many of you still have in your homes today. And this is what he said. I love this. He says, I have not failed. I have just found 10,000 ways that won't work. And he understood that every time you fail, it's another step closer to your final and ultimate success. Do you know that even Chuck Norris failed? It's true. In high school, he failed chemistry. He just couldn't learn the periodic table. And that's because Chuck Norris only believes in the element of surprise. It's a good one. As you look through Scripture, you discover that every great man and every great woman actually went through a series of failures before they ever succeeded. If you're done by the time you fail, then you've misunderstood the process. In fact, failure is this prerequisite, like I've said. I mean, you look at Moses. He was called to deliver Egypt. How did he do with to deliver the Jews from Egypt? How did he do in his first attempt? Moses. Remember, he killed the Egyptian. He didn't do so well. He ended up, wallowing away in the backside of the desert for 40 years before he came back. And the next time he did it, he was a success. We have Joshua and Caleb. We talked about them last week, and they were to lead the children of Israel into the promised land. How did they do on their first attempt? They did not go in, and they spent 40 years wandering in the wilderness. You look at King David. He was anointed to be king when he was just a young boy. How did that work out for him? He was 15 years before he became king. Why didn't he become king? Because his father-in-law wanted to kill him. I don't know what kind of problem you're having with your in-laws. This guy had serious problems. And he had to endure failure after failure. He was living in a cave half the time. You go read his story. It was absolutely paved with failures all the way along the way until finally it says, and all of Israel loved David and made him king. You look at Nehemiah, who restored the city of Jerusalem after it was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. And did that just sort of throw itself together? Go read the story. They tried many times to rebuild the walls and rebuild the cities, and they failed again and again. Even in Nehemiah's day, there was opposition, and they wore out, and they lost vision for it. But he just continued to press in, and as he continued to press in, eventually he got there. You look into the New Testament, and you see Jesus' disciples. How did they do? Did they ever fail? Hello, that was their middle name, right? I mean, they were always coming. Why couldn't we cast out this demon? Why couldn't we heal this person? And Jesus is saying, because of your lack of faith. And so even though these guys failed again and again and again, eventually what happened? Eventually they rose to become the greatest men of God that ever lived, other than Jesus Christ himself. Every time you look at successes in life, I guarantee you, you will see a road paved with failure. I know many of you enjoy the success of this church, and that's great and that's nice, but what you probably don't know is my first attempt at church planting was a royal failure. After 12 months, the founding members hired a lawyer and wanted me to go to jail. You say, why did they want you to go to jail? Because murder is against the law, and lynching had been outlawed. That's why. And so they took, whatever legal means. You say, Pastor Mark, were you really that bad of a pastor? Yes, actually, I was. I just didn't know anything from anything. And it was those failures in life that actually lead us on this path to success. Let me close with one final story here today. In 1963, there was a man by the name of Maxie Filer. Here's a picture of him. And he lived in California, and he went to Washington for the big rally in 1963 that Martin Luther King Jr. had on civil rights. And he was so inspired by this that he decided that he was going to go to law school, and he was going to become a lawyer, and he was going to fight for civil rights through the process of law. So he goes home, he goes to law school, he graduated in 1966, he went and wrote the bar exam, and he failed. So 6 months later, he wrote it again, and he failed. So then he had to travel to another state 6 months later, and he wrote it in another state. And he failed. So 6 months later, he went to another state and failed. 6 months later, he went to another state and failed. 6 months later, he went to another state and failed. Are you seeing a pattern developing here? And they figure he spent $50,000 traveling to other states and challenging the bar exam. And he went from state after state, and every 6 months he wrote the bar exam. And every 6 months he failed the bar exam. For 25 years, he failed the bar exam 47 times. And then in 1991, he wrote the bar exam for his 48th time, and he passed. Now, for the life of me, I would never want this guy as my lawyer, right? But I want to give the guy full marks for persistence. He failed and failed and failed 47 times. In the course of that time, his son grew up, went to law school, passed the bar exam, and started his own practice. True story. And this guy worked in his son's law firm, waiting to someday, finally he's a senior citizen and he passes the bar exam. And he's finally a lawyer. He ended up going and becoming the city councilor for his city, which was Compton, California. And this is a success story straight out of Compton, right? Some of you get that. Failure is not the opposite of success. Failure is the prerequisite of success. Let me close with this quote from one of the great inspirational speakers of all time, Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan of the NBA, when he was at the height of his career, did a Nike ad that I will never forget. And this is what he says. He says, I have missed more than 9,000 shots. I have lost more than 300 games. 26 times I've been entrusted with the game-winning shot, and I have missed. I have failed over and over and over again. That is why I succeed. There are no failures in this life, only failed attempts. Aren't you glad you came to church today? Let's stand together.